Hello everyone, I hope you're settling in comfortably tonight, ready to drift off into a world that's long gone but somehow still alive in memory. Before we dive in, I have a small curiosity. Where are you listening from right now, and what time is it where you are? It's always fascinating to imagine how a story like this reaches all corners of the world, from quiet apartments in bustling cities to remote towns where the only sound is the wind brushing through the trees. Being a squad leader during the Second World War wasn't just a job, it was an entire universe condensed into trenches, foxholes, and endless marches that stretched across landscapes scarred by both nature and conflict. I remember the first time I stepped into that role, the weight of responsibility pressing down like the thickest fog rolling off the hills in Normandy. There was a constant hum in the air, almost imperceptible, a mixture of engines from distant vehicles, the occasional distant gunfire, and the chatter of men trying to keep their spirits from fracturing under the strain of anticipation. Our mornings rarely had a sense of gentle awakening. We were roused by the sharp calls of sergeants, or sometimes just the unforgiving sun climbing over the horizon, scattering shadows over our makeshift tents. Breakfast, if it could even be called that, consisted mostly of hard biscuits that cracked when bitten and a bitter coffee that might have been a mix of roasted grains rather than beans. There was a ritual to it, though, everyone sitting in a semicircle, some silently smoking whatever scraps of tobacco they could trade or find, others quietly polishing their weapons as if the shine could somehow ward off what the day might throw at us. I used these moments to skin faces, to see who carried fear quietly tucked under a brave exterior, and who had already let their nerves unravel. Leadership wasn't just about issuing commands, it was about understanding the invisible threads that held the unit together. Once the day started, orders came down like clockwork, but execution was anything but predictable. Sometimes we would spend hours walking across fields that seemed endless, the earth torn by shells from battles long past, every step a careful negotiation with the ground that could give way into a crater or a hidden trap. Occasionally, there was a lull, an uncanny stillness where time seemed to stretch. That's when rumors would flourish, whispered stories about movements in the enemy lines, or legends of soldiers who had vanished without a trace and were said to have returned as shadows in the night, silently observing the living. We never knew which stories were true, and perhaps that was the point. They gave shape to fear, allowed us to confront it with cautious laughter and nervous glances. Food, or what passed for food in our daily routine, became a form of survival art. Sometimes we managed to secure fresh rations, meat that had been salted and preserved, canned beans that filled the belly but rarely delighted the senses, and the occasional fruit that felt miraculous against the backdrop of monotonous meals. When we could, someone would find a fire, and we'd try to make something resembling a proper meal, a momentary reclamation of normal life in a world dominated by chaos. There were stories of soldiers trading recipes in secret, making soup out of what others discarded, or improvising bread with whatever grains they could find. These small victories mattered, more than I realized at the time, because they were pockets of humanity we could cling to when the world threatened to reduce us to mere survival machines. But it wasn't all strategy and survival. Humor, surprisingly, found its way even into the most harrowing circumstances. Men would imitate officers with exaggerated precision, sing old folk songs that seemed absurd in the mud and smoke, or play pranks that, in the light of daily danger, seemed audaciously fearless. I remember once a young private convinced half the unit that a certain stretch of the field was cursed, claiming that any man who stepped on a particular patch of mud would be invisible to everyone else until sundown. We all played along, tiptoeing, laughing in hushed tones, feeling an ephemeral sense of control over a world that offered us very little. At night, the camp would transform into something almost dreamlike, though sleep was rarely guaranteed. Fires flickered, casting shadows that danced across tired faces, and the quiet was punctuated by sporadic orders, distant artillery, or the occasional plaintive howl of a fox or dog that had found its way to our encampment. Letters from home circulated, if the mail reached us at all, and the reading of a single line from a loved one could bring smiles, tears, or a profound silence as men wrestled with longing and duty. I often wondered how the same sun touched their homes as it did our camps, and whether they imagined us as shadows moving through an endless haze of smoke and mud. Leadership was an unending series of choices. I had to decide not only where to move, how to react under fire, and when to conserve resources, but also when to intervene in disputes that erupted from exhaustion and stress, when to allow a moment of levity, and when to enforce strict discipline to keep the unit intact. Sometimes, the simplest decisions carried the heaviest weight, like whether to share a bit of extra rations with a new recruit struggling to keep pace, or to push forward and risk morale for the sake of maintaining order. Each choice rippled outward, affecting not only immediate outcomes but the invisible threads of trust and camaraderie that held us together. Rumors, too, were a constant companion. Stories of distant victories, heroic sacrifices, and impossible escapes spread through the unit like wildfire, shaping expectations, feeding anxieties, or inspiring courage. And in the quiet moments, I often reflected on how much of history is built not on monumental battles alone, but on the accumulation of countless small decisions, fleeting moments of human connection, and the quiet endurance of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. The first light of dawn often brought with it a strange combination of relief and dread. The night had passed, sometimes uneventfully, sometimes with bursts of noise that jolted even the sleepiest soldier upright, hearts racing, hands gripping weapons that suddenly felt heavier than the day before. As a squad leader, I learned quickly that the dawn didn't care about your fear or fatigue. It simply arrived, a constant reminder that the day demanded action, attention, and sometimes decisions no human should be forced to make. We moved through landscapes that seemed almost designed to test patience and nerves. Bombed-out villages with walls that leaned at impossible angles, forests so dense that sunlight barely touched the earth, and fields where mud could swallow boots whole. All of it became part of our reality. Orders came from higher command, often cryptic and at times contradictory, and it fell to me to interpret them in a way that kept men alive, spirits intact, and missions achievable. I discovered early that leadership wasn't about knowing every answer. It was about being able to improvise when answers didn't exist, and convincing others that what you improvised was worth following. Conversations, when they occurred, were delicate affairs. Small talk could feel like a lifeline, a fragile thread connecting us to normalcy. Soldiers discussed mundane things. Letters from home, the latest books or newspapers someone had managed to scavenge, the strange assortment of music one had heard on a crackling radio. But beneath these casual exchanges lurked unspoken anxieties. Fear was always present, though we rarely named it aloud. It was in the tremor of a hand reaching for a cup of coffee, in the hesitation before stepping over a crater, in the way men sometimes stared into the distance as if they could foresee what lay ahead. Food continued to be a strange blend of sustenance and morale. On some days, we managed to cook meals that smelled almost like home, thin slices of cured meat, bread warmed over a fire, and on rare occasions, fresh vegetables from local gardens. We learned quickly which items could be traded, which could be stretched to feed more mouths, and which could be used to boost spirits through small but meaningful gestures. A single can of jam, split carefully among the group, could create laughter and animated stories as we imagined how absurd it would be to smuggle it back home for family breakfasts. These moments, small as they were, became the glue holding our humanity together. Exercise and routine were often punctuated by strange forms of entertainment. We would sometimes challenge each other to races across fields, testing not only speed but coordination over treacherous terrain. Others would engage in quiet games of skill, tossing stones at distant targets, or seeing who could sharpen their bayonet most efficiently. Music, when we were lucky enough to have it, became a temporary escape. Someone might hum a familiar tune while the firelight flickered across tired faces, or beat out rhythms on the wooden sides of crates, creating an impromptu drum circle that made us feel momentarily detached from the relentless tension that defined every other second. Then there were the rumors. Stories that spread through whispers at twilight, each man embellishing the tale slightly more than the last, until it became part myth, part warning. Some claimed that a certain hill was cursed, that anyone who slept there would have dreams that predicted outcomes, good or bad. Others spoke of soldiers who had disappeared in the forests, only to return with strange knowledge or abilities, as though the earth itself had chosen to impart secrets. I would listen, sometimes amused, sometimes unsettled, knowing that even if the stories were false, their impact was real. They shaped behavior, caution, and courage in ways orders never could. Fatigue, of course, was constant. We marched for hours, sometimes days, with brief pauses for water, food, and the occasional moment to stretch stiff limbs. Sleep was often stolen in short intervals, under the open sky or in the shelter of ruined buildings, where walls offered little protection but a sense of privacy. I learned to notice the signs of exhaustion in my men, the way one soldier's eyes would glaze over while sharpening a blade, or how another's voice would tremble slightly during conversation. Part of leadership was knowing when to push and when to hold back, when discipline mattered and when mercy was the only choice that would preserve the unit's cohesion. Letters from home were a constant presence in the background. Even when delayed or incomplete, they carried immense weight. I watched as a man unfolded a crumpled note from his sister or mother, tracing the edges with fingers that had grown rough from handling weapons and gear, and felt a silent transformation. Tension softened, posture eased, and for a fleeting moment, war seemed distant. We shared these moments quietly, respecting their significance without intrusion. I realized then that leadership also meant guarding these private islands of comfort, ensuring that a harsh word or careless action didn't shatter them. Occasionally, nature itself would intervene, reminding us of the world beyond human conflict. A sudden rainstorm would flood trenches and paths, turning mud into a sticky adversary, yet also providing a cleansing rhythm against the backdrop of relentless tension. Birds, when they dared appear, seemed almost comical in their obliviousness, hopping along shelled grounds and dodging debris with surprising dexterity. Even in the midst of destruction, the persistence of life offered a quiet, almost mocking contrast to our efforts to maintain order, survival, and control over chaos. At the end of each day, when the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched long over the devastated landscapes, I often reflected on how leadership extended beyond tactics and strategy. It was about empathy, observation, subtle manipulation of morale, and above all, endurance. Men needed more than instructions. They needed hope, distraction, small victories, and the occasional story that reminded them of life beyond gunfire and mud. Every choice, every word, every shared moment contributed to the invisible thread connecting us, keeping us functional, human, and, against the odds, sometimes even joyful. Even as the nights became familiar, there was never a true sense of comfort. Shadows cast by flickering fires seemed to move with intent, sometimes catching the corner of your eye and disappearing the instant you focused. We joked that the ghosts of the past were wandering among us, though privately I wondered if every rustle of leaves or distant howl carried meaning we were too exhausted to decipher. The mind, under constant stress and vigilance, becomes a storyteller on its own, inventing threats and heroes alike. As a squad leader, I had to remain the anchor, steady in a world that never paused, even for breath. Even as the nights became familiar, there was never a true sense of comfort. Shadows cast by flickering fires seemed to move with intent, sometimes catching the corner of your eye and disappearing the instant you focused. We joked that the ghosts of the past were wandering among us, though privately I wondered if every rustle of leaves or distant howl carried meaning we were too exhausted to decipher. The mind, under constant stress and vigilance, becomes a storyteller on its own, inventing threats and heroes alike. As a squad leader, I had to remain the anchor, steady in a world that never paused, even for breath. Our movements between camps became a ritual of vigilance and improvisation. Paths once familiar could transform overnight, sabotaged by nature or the shifting front lines. Fields that had seemed safe the day before were now pockmarked with new craters, hidden pitfalls, or signs of enemy patrols. Navigation required more than maps and compass readings. It required instinct sharpened by countless hours observing the land, learning to read the subtle cues of disturbance in foliage, the tilt of abandoned equipment, or the faint traces of footprints long faded by wind and rain. Even the simplest decision, like which side of a hedge to hug or which ditch to cross, carried weight that could mean life or death. Meals remained a blend of necessity and ritual. On some days, we stumbled upon a farmer's hidden stash, barrels of potatoes, a handful of eggs, or a cluster of apples that had somehow survived the chaos. The joy of cooking something fresh over an open flame was indescribable. The men laughed more freely, and even the quietest, most withdrawn soldiers seemed to breathe easier. We developed makeshift traditions, carving initials into firewood, sharing secret toasts of coffee, or giving nicknames to portions of food as though naming them would make them last longer. Humor, even tiny and fleeting, acted as a shield against despair. Conversations, though often interrupted by duty, carried layers of meaning. A man might casually comment on the weather, but it was a test. How alert was the squad, how ready to act at a moment's notice. I listened closely to subtleties, tone, hesitation, the slight fidgeting of a hand, and learned more about morale and mental state than any inspection could reveal. The weight of leadership meant constantly balancing attention between survival, execution of orders, and the unseen emotional undercurrents that could fracture a group in a second. Rumors flourished with a life of their own, often more potent at dusk than dawn. Some whispered of miraculous escapes by lone soldiers, their stories exaggerated to legendary proportions, spreading courage, or envy, or fear, throughout the ranks. Others hinted at hidden caches of supplies left by retreating forces, sparking expeditions that sometimes led to fortune, sometimes to disappointment, and occasionally to danger. I learned to let such stories circulate. They fueled imagination and vigilance, but I also had to temper them with reality, reminding the men that hope without preparation was a fragile, dangerous thing. Sleep, when it came, was both a necessity and a gamble. We often dozed in shifts, huddled in trenches or behind walls that offered minimal protection from cold, rain, or enemy observation. Dreams were a strange blend of the familiar and the horrific. Memories of home mingled with distorted reflections of battle, creating a landscape where time and place lost meaning. I sometimes watched my men sleep, their chests rising and falling in the rhythm of exhaustion, knowing that the next hour could bring orders that would rip them from this brief sanctuary. Protecting that sleep, however fleeting, became part of my unspoken duties. Communication was a constant challenge. Messages had to be relayed through runners, signal flags, or radios with inconsistent ranges. Miscommunication could escalate into disaster in moments, so I learned to anticipate misunderstandings, to craft instructions layered with clarity, repetition, and contingency. Leadership demanded not just authority, but the ability to foresee how even minor deviations could cascade into dangerous situations. Every successful relay of orders, every coordinated movement under pressure, reinforced the fragile trust that bound us. The environment itself was relentless. Mud, rain, sun, and wind were as much adversaries as any opposing force. Boots would fill with water, weapons would jam from grime and moisture, and clothing would cling uncomfortably, sapping energy with every movement. We adapted by creating improvised shelters, reinforcing equipment, and learning to endure discomfort without complaint. Small victories, keeping a pair of socks dry, patching a torn coat, or improvising a rain barrier, became celebrated achievements, almost ritualistic in their significance. Moments of reflection were rare but profound. I often found myself staring at the remnants of what had been towns, villages, and farmlands, imagining the lives interrupted, families displaced, and futures forever altered. It was impossible not to feel both sorrow and awe at the scale of human resilience, the way people adapted, survived, and, in secret, maintained rituals and joys even as war raged around them. I sometimes shared these reflections with my men, not as sermons but as invitations to see that our struggle was part of a larger, incomprehensible tapestry of endurance. Games and distractions evolved organically. Card games, dice, and even improvised competitions provided a mental escape. One man might challenge another to a race across a shell-pocked field, while another suggested guessing the number of steps to the next trench. These contests, trivial on the surface, held deeper significance. They reinforced teamwork, kept minds agile, and reminded us that even in a world dominated by chaos, play had its place. Letters, too, continued to anchor us. Even if they arrived weeks late, the act of reading them aloud, sharing fragments of life from home, created communal warmth. Names, events, and memories traveled across continents, binding us to the people we loved and the lives we hoped to reclaim. These moments were often accompanied by silence, a shared recognition of longing that transcended words. They reminded us that beyond the uniform, beyond the mud and fire, we were human, capable of tenderness, hope, and reflection. Leadership, amid all this, was a delicate balance. Orders had to be issued with precision, morale nurtured, fatigue monitored, and safety considered, yet there was always the unpredictable, the sudden storm, the unexpected encounter, the whispered rumor that could ignite tension or courage. Each day demanded vigilance, empathy, improvisation, and courage, often in equal measure. I understood, more and more, that being a squad leader was not merely about command. It was about stewardship of human endurance, guiding not just bodies but minds and hearts through the chaos. By the time the sun had climbed high into the sky, fatigue often had already begun its subtle work, sapping attention and blurring focus. Yet movement never ceased. Orders arrived in waves, sometimes coherent, sometimes contradictory, and I learned that interpretation, timing, and instinct were more valuable than mere obedience. Each decision, when to advance, when to hold, when to send a scout, carried invisible consequences that could ripple across the squad's effectiveness and morale. I often felt the weight of unseen eyes, of men depending on every choice, silently observing, measuring confidence and hesitation alike. Supply lines were unpredictable. Sometimes we received packages containing essentials, fresh bread, preserved meat, or occasionally cigarettes, which became a form of currency and comfort rolled into one. Other days, rations were sparse, and improvisation became crucial. We scavenged fields, bartered with villagers cautiously, and learned to turn the most mundane items into survival tools. The smallest victory, a jar of jam divided fairly, a loaf of bread stretched across hungry mouths, was celebrated quietly but with a sense of triumph. It reminded us that even amidst chaos, life could provide small miracles. Interactions among the squad were layered and complex. Bonds formed rapidly, yet tension could flare just as quickly. Misunderstandings, accidental slights, or minor failures often required intervention, negotiation, or subtle manipulation to maintain cohesion. Humor, gossip, and shared secrets became tools of leadership. A carefully timed joke, a shared story from home, or even a quiet acknowledgement of exhaustion could diffuse tension and reinforce trust. Maintaining these delicate social structures was as crucial as any tactical decision on the battlefield. The terrain itself was an unending adversary. Mud swallowed boots, rain turned trenches into rivers, and sun reflected off barren fields, sapping energy. Each environment demanded adjustments, routes had to be reconsidered, supplies redistributed, and morale constantly monitored. The landscape shaped not only our physical movements, but the psychology of the unit. I learned to read it like a living entity, predicting how it would challenge us and using its features strategically, whether for cover, concealment, or the subtle advantage of elevation. Moments of respite, though rare, were cherished. Evening fires, brief exchanges of letters, and shared meals offered fleeting solace. I watched men laugh quietly at a joke, savor a stolen bite of chocolate, or whisper stories from home, aware that these simple human acts were powerful antidotes to fear and exhaustion. I encouraged them, subtly emphasizing that even amidst war, small joys could preserve sanity and courage. Scouting and reconnaissance brought a different rhythm. Moving ahead of the main unit demanded caution, observation, and sometimes daring. Every footstep carried risk, every rustle of foliage could signify friend or foe, and the mind became a finely tuned sensor, scanning for anomalies in movement, light, or sound. I often paired men carefully, observing who complemented each other's instincts, who could remain silent under pressure, and who might falter in critical moments. Leadership in these situations was quiet, subtle, and intensely focused, yet the consequences were profound. The psychological landscape was as treacherous as the physical one. Fear manifested in countless ways: hesitation, distraction, tension, or even overconfidence. Rumors, whether true or imagined, amplified anxiety. Some men would insist a certain building was haunted, that shadows carried threats, or that distant artillery had unseen observers. I listened, allowed the stories to circulate, and sometimes subtly guided them, ensuring that imagination served vigilance rather than panic. These mental strategies became invisible tools of survival, shaping perception and reaction with precision that no manual could teach. Rest was often punctuated by ritual. Even a brief moment to clean a weapon, arrange personal belongings, or sip coffee carried significance. Such rituals preserved dignity and structure, offering psychological anchors in a world dominated by chaos. Men would sometimes share small competitions: who could polish their boots fastest, who could identify plants, or even trivial bets on distance and timing. These diversions weren't frivolous. They reinforced focus, camaraderie, and resilience, blending play with preparation in a seamless, often unconscious, manner. Stories from other units arrived sporadically, often reshaped with exaggeration or drama. Heroic feats, miraculous escapes, or near disasters were recounted in hushed tones around fires. The veracity mattered less than the effect. They inspired courage, reinforced standards, and shaped expectations. I monitored these narratives closely, knowing they could either bolster morale or incite fear. Leadership was as much about guiding perception as managing tangible actions. At night, the world transformed again. Shadows elongated, sounds carried farther, and the mind drifted between vigilance and exhaustion. Fires flickered, casting moving mosaics on mud-stained faces. Some men read letters by the weak light, others whispered to companions, and a few stared into the darkness, lost in thought. I patrolled, listened, and reflected, acutely aware that even in stillness, duty never ended. The world was alive with subtle threats: wildlife, weather, the potential for sudden engagement, and awareness had to be constant, even as the body screamed for rest. Leadership demanded foresight. Every morning, I reviewed the terrain, considered supply status, and anticipated the squad's needs and vulnerabilities. Every interaction, from casual banter to direct orders, carried layers of impact. I discovered that command was not merely about authority. It was a complex web of observation, adaptation, empathy, and strategic influence. Small gestures, a reassuring word, an acknowledgement of fatigue, or a shared memory, could stabilize a unit as effectively as precise maneuvers or meticulous planning. Days blurred into each other, though every hour felt weighted with significance. As a squad leader, I learned that perception of time itself shifted during war. Morning could feel like minutes, and a single hour under heavy fire stretched like eternity. Each man carried his own rhythm of endurance. Some moved with steady efficiency, others required constant encouragement, and a few teetered at the edge of exhaustion or despair. Watching, listening, and understanding these nuances became a form of vigilance no less critical than scanning for enemy movements or tracking supply lines. The interactions between soldiers were endlessly fascinating, a mix of camaraderie, tension, humor, and unspoken hierarchies. We developed routines that balanced discipline with flexibility. One man might polish weapons meticulously while another quietly hummed an old folk song, and their coexistence created a rhythm that kept the squad functioning. Arguments occasionally erupted over rations, territory, or personal space, but most were diffused with subtle mediation, an observation here, a quiet reminder of duty there. The art of leadership, I discovered, was as much about navigating personalities as it was about executing strategy. Food remained both necessity and subtle morale booster. Occasionally, scavenged supplies revealed unexpected treats. Cans of fruit preserved just enough to be edible, salted meat that smelled like victory, or even a bar of chocolate hidden in someone's pack. We transformed these moments into mini celebrations, laughing, joking, and savoring what might otherwise have been a fleeting pleasure. Cooking itself became improvisational artistry, melting chocolate into tea, crafting bread from scavenged flour, or devising soups from the most unlikely combination of ingredients. Each meal was not just nourishment, but a ritual reaffirming our humanity amidst the chaos surrounding us. Rumors continued to weave their way through the unit, each carrying weight far beyond its origin. Tales of phantom snipers, secret enemy movements, or legendary acts of bravery circulated at firesides, whispered intense, and sometimes exaggerated with each retelling. Though some were fanciful, they influenced behavior profoundly. Caution heightened, vigilance sharpened, and imagination allowed men to anticipate possibilities beyond the immediately visible. I learned to let these narratives flow, guiding interpretation subtly while ensuring fear never eclipsed rational judgment. Reconnaissance missions demanded a different form of attention. I often paired men based on complementary instincts, one with keen eyesight, another with the ability to remain silent under pressure. Every footstep, every rustle of leaves, every subtle shift in terrain was a potential clue. Movement became a dance with the landscape, blending observation, stealth, and instinct. One wrong decision, a misread shadow, a misinterpreted sound, could spell danger for both scout and squad. Leadership in these moments was a quiet intensity, requiring concentration that stretched across hours and miles without relief. Letters and news from home maintained their almost sacred status. Even a brief note could transform a day, providing a touchstone of normalcy that reminded men of life beyond war. I observed how the act of reading, sharing, or merely holding a letter affected demeanor. Tense shoulders relaxed, eyes brightened, laughter emerged more readily, and silence carried the weight of longing and love. Leadership meant protecting these fragile connections, ensuring that the routine and pressures of duty did not crush the small but vital bridges to the world we had left behind. The psychological landscape remained a constant challenge. Fear, anxiety, and fatigue manifested in subtle ways: hesitation before a command, repetitive questioning, or even withdrawal from conversation. I watched for these signals, knowing that one overlooked moment could cascade into a larger problem. At the same time, resilience often appeared in unexpected places. A private who barely spoke could suddenly perform an extraordinary task under pressure, reminding us all that strength was rarely visible until tested. Nature itself was an adversary and a teacher. Torrential rain transformed fields into impassable mud, yet the same storm refreshed streams and created camouflage that could be tactically advantageous. Birds, insects, and the quiet murmur of the forest carried both life and lessons. Even the mundane, sliding through mud, balancing on logs, or navigating thorny underbrush, required adaptability. Observation of these details became instinct, second nature, and when combined with strategy, a subtle edge over the unpredictable environment. Games and competitions persisted, evolving with creativity and necessity. Improvised races, challenges in aim or dexterity, and quiet contests of observation or memory maintained alertness while fostering a sense of unity. These activities were far from trivial. They reinforced cohesion, attention, and resilience. The squad relied not only on orders but on trust cultivated through these shared, often silent, experiences. Even laughter served a strategic purpose, lifting the weight of fear and reinforcing a shared identity that transcended individual worry or fatigue. Nightfall brought another shift. Shadows grew, and sounds carried farther. Fires were lit with care, letters were read, and stories whispered in low tones. Sleep was fragmented, taken in shifts, yet these stolen hours were essential to survival. Patrols moved silently, scouts returned with updates, and I walked among the squad, observing, listening, and planning. Each decision, however small, where to place guards, how to arrange equipment, when to allow rest, carried significance. Leadership, I realized, existed in the cumulative effect of countless small choices rather than grand gestures alone. As days continued, I became increasingly aware of how every detail mattered. The way men packed gear, the order in which tasks were performed, and even how we reacted to minor setbacks shaped overall performance and morale. Small gestures, a word of encouragement, a shared ration, or a quiet acknowledgement of hardship, carried disproportionate weight. Leadership became a continuous interplay of observation, intuition, and deliberate action, blending strategy with empathy, rigor with subtlety, and constant vigilance with understanding of the human spirit. The days often began before dawn, when the world was still shrouded in mist and the first light painted the horizon with muted colors. It was during these hours that decisions felt heaviest, when the mind struggled to separate reality from anticipation. Orders were received, sometimes whispered, sometimes delivered with urgency, and I would spend long moments considering every variable: the terrain, the squad's condition, the potential for enemy activity, and the psychological state of each man under my command. Leadership demanded a constant calibration of observation and intuition, balancing the visible with the invisible, the predictable with the unforeseen. Marching across uneven terrain became an intricate dance. Every footfall had to be calculated, not just to avoid injury, but to remain alert to the subtle signs of danger, the displaced soil hinting at hidden craters, the faint footprints of an unseen patrol, or the way foliage shifted in the wind. Mud caked our boots and clothing, water seeped through torn gear, and yet movement never ceased. I watched my men, noting who struggled, who adapted, who remained vigilant despite fatigue, and who relied on instinct to navigate both landscape and circumstance. These observations shaped every decision I made: when to pause, when to push forward, when to adjust formations. Food continued to be a lifeline, but also a source of ingenuity. We often relied on forage supplies, turning scraps into meals that were both nourishing and morale-boosting. A handful of dried beans became stew. A few potatoes could be roasted over embers. I noticed how the act of preparing food transformed the squad's atmosphere. Laughter emerged, stories from home were exchanged, and even the quietest soldier found moments of ease. Each shared meal became more than sustenance. It was a reaffirmation of connection, a brief reclaiming of normalcy in a world dominated by chaos. Rumors, ever present and evolving, shaped perceptions. Some spoke of phantom movements in the forest, others of unlikely rescues or sudden enemy retreats. Each tale, whether true or fabricated, influenced behavior and heightened awareness. I learned to gauge the impact of these stories, subtly guiding interpretation without suppressing imagination. They became tools as important as maps or weapons, influencing vigilance, morale, and decision-making in ways that were often invisible but undeniably real. Reconnaissance missions demanded both courage and patience. Scouts moved ahead in pairs, observing terrain and reporting findings with precision. Every sound, shadow, or movement was scrutinized. Mistakes could be fatal. I paired soldiers carefully, balancing complementary skills and temperaments, and often accompanied them when conditions were particularly treacherous. These excursions were exercises in observation, patience, and anticipation, teaching us that survival depended as much on subtle awareness as on firepower or tactics. Letters from home continued to serve as lifelines. Even the smallest note could transform mood, restore focus, or inspire determination. I observed how reading words from loved ones could brighten a weary expression, loosen tense shoulders, or spark fleeting laughter. Protecting these connections became part of leadership, ensuring that men had privacy, opportunity, and time to savor the small but vital bridge to the world they had left behind. It was remarkable how the simple act of correspondence carried weight far beyond its physical presence. Fatigue was relentless, yet discipline required adaptation. Sleep was often brief, taken in shifts, in trenches or behind minimal cover, and dreams mingled memories of home with fragments of battle, creating a surreal mental landscape. Observing my men as they slept, I noted subtle signs of exhaustion, tremors, restless movements, or the faint tension of fingers clenching. These small indicators informed how I allocated tasks, organized watch schedules, and decided when to grant brief reprieves. Leadership, I realized, was as much about managing human endurance as it was about executing strategy. Interaction among the squad carried multiple layers. Bonds formed rapidly, yet conflict and tension were never absent. Minor disputes, over rations, space, or perceived slights, were inevitable. Subtle mediation, humor, or distraction often preserved cohesion. Observing how individuals responded to these pressures provided insight into their resilience, adaptability, and loyalty. Trust, once earned, became a fragile but powerful asset, supporting the squad's functioning under conditions that tested every limit. Nature continued to challenge and instruct. Sudden storms turned pathways into rivers, wind carried sounds in unexpected ways, and uneven terrain demanded constant attention. Each element influenced strategy, movement, and morale. Observation became instinct. I could sense shifts in weather, terrain, and light before they became obvious. The squad learned to rely on this awareness, interpreting natural cues as part of the ongoing calculation of risk and opportunity. Even small victories, such as navigating through mud without losing supplies, became moments of collective pride and subtle celebration. Games and informal competitions persisted, blending play with practical skill. Races across fields, contests of aim, or challenges of observation kept minds alert, fostered camaraderie, and reinforced subtle elements of coordination. These activities were far from trivial. They were essential for maintaining mental acuity, focus, and group cohesion. Laughter, though rare, became a tool, releasing tension and fortifying the invisible bonds that connected the squad. Nightfall brought reflection, vigilance, and subtle tension. Fires were tended carefully, letters read in quiet corners, and shadows lengthened across mud-splattered faces. Sleep was fragmented and never guaranteed. Patrols moved silently, scouts returned with reports, and I walked among the squad, observing, listening, planning. Each small decision. Where to place guards, how to arrange supplies, when to allow rest, carried weight that could ripple outward. Leadership existed in the sum of countless small choices, not in dramatic gestures. As the day ended, I reflected on the rhythm of survival, the weight of command, and the intricate weave of human endurance. Every moment, interaction, and decision shaped outcomes far beyond immediate perception. Leadership required observation, intuition, empathy, and adaptability, blending the tactical with the human, the predictable with the unpredictable, in a continuous dance that defined life and war. Every act, whether issuing an order, sharing a meal, or offering quiet reassurance, became part of the invisible scaffolding that allowed the squad to continue, endure, and against all odds, survive. The first true skirmishes arrived without warning, breaking the rhythm of days that had been filled with preparation, reconnaissance, and quiet tension. It was subtle at first, a distant crack, a flash of movement at the edge of visibility, and suddenly the world transformed into a theater of immediate danger. As a squad leader, I felt the weight of responsibility crush in an instant. Every decision, every instruction, every motion had the potential to save lives or to condemn. The men moved with a combination of instinct and training, yet I could see in their eyes the flicker of fear that never fully disappeared, even in the most hardened veterans. The clash itself was chaotic, disorienting, and strangely intimate. Mud sucked at boots, gunfire echoed against crumbled walls, and the scent of smoke and earth filled every inhalation. Every choice, where to position a soldier, how to advance, whether to hold ground or retreat, carried immediate consequence. I shouted orders over the cacophony, gestures punctuating commands when voices failed, and constantly scanned faces for hesitation, confusion, or bravery. Leadership was no longer abstract. It was visceral, immediate, and total. Even in combat, small rituals persisted. Men adjusted their grips, checked their equipment, and shared quick nods or brief words of encouragement. A soldier handed another a canteen, a glance conveying both concern and solidarity. These micro-actions, seemingly insignificant, were vital. They sustained morale, reinforced trust, and reminded everyone that amid chaos, human connection could not be abandoned. I realized that in moments of extreme danger, leadership was not just issuing orders. It was guiding the collective psyche, maintaining cohesion, and preventing panic from fracturing the unit. After the first engagement, when the adrenaline began to ebb, we discovered the landscape had changed irrevocably. Craters pocked fields that had seemed navigable hours earlier, buildings that offered shelter now stood as jagged skeletons of masonry, and the air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and churned soil. The squad moved cautiously, surveying for hidden threats while attending to the wounded. Every sound, every rustle, every faint whisper of movement demanded attention. The weight of vigilance pressed upon us relentlessly. Mistakes, even minor ones, could be fatal. Food, always a concern, became even more precious. Rations were stretched, scavenged items were transformed into meals, and moments of eating were conducted quickly, quietly, and with an almost ceremonial care. I noticed how men lingered over the smallest portions, savoring flavor that would have seemed trivial in peacetime. Sharing these meager meals became a reaffirmation of solidarity. Bread passed hand to hand, water offered to a soldier grimacing from exertion, the occasional smile exchanged as if to say, "We endure together." Even in scarcity, these acts reinforced the invisible threads holding the squad together. Rumors took on a new intensity in the aftermath of combat. Tales of ambushes, phantom snipers, and miraculous escapes traveled quickly, evolving with each retelling. Soldiers spoke of distant heroics, vanishing foes, or sudden reinforcements, and the stories, whether true or fabricated, shaped behavior profoundly. I learned to navigate these currents carefully, allowing imagination to bolster courage without letting fear take root. Each narrative, whispered in tents or around dwindling fires, became part of the invisible battlefield of perception, influencing decisions, vigilance, and morale. Reconnaissance and patrols assumed heightened significance. I paired soldiers with complementary skills, one with sharp eyesight, another with calm composure under pressure. Every movement, sound, and shadow required analysis. Stepping into a clearing could reveal enemy positions or traps. Remaining behind cover could prevent disaster. We learned to read the land with precision: tilt of broken walls, footprints in mud, the pattern of leaves disturbed by wind. These subtle observations became as critical as any weapon, informing every tactical decision and ensuring survival against an ever-present, unpredictable adversary. Letters from home retained their almost sacred quality. Even brief messages could shift the emotional landscape, restore focus, or inspire courage. I observed soldiers reading with trembling hands, eyes glistening with emotion, and noted how these simple objects anchored hope amidst chaos. Protecting access to correspondence became part of my duties. A single torn or delayed letter could carry disproportionate consequences on morale, and I ensured that such fragile connections remained intact wherever possible. The psychological toll deepened with each encounter. Fear, exhaustion, and tension manifested in hesitation, silence, or irritability. Observing these signals became a constant practice, informing assignments, rotations, and interventions. I learned to balance strict enforcement of discipline with moments of empathy, a quiet word of reassurance, a shared memory, or acknowledgement of fatigue often preserved cohesion more effectively than reprimand. Leadership was a delicate weave of tactical decisions and emotional intelligence, each thread essential to sustaining the squad. Nature, indifferent to human conflict, continued its relentless influence. Rain transformed the battlefield into a treacherous quagmire. Wind carried sounds in unpredictable ways, masking or revealing movements. Sunlight created deceptive shadows. Every environmental variable shaped our choices, from positioning and movement to rest and ration distribution. Observing, interpreting, and anticipating these elements became instinctive, a subconscious layer of vigilance layered atop strategic and psychological awareness. Even amid the intensity of battle, small diversions persisted. Improvised competitions, quick races, or games of aim maintained mental agility and fostered camaraderie. Laughter, rare and fleeting, served a tactical purpose as much as a psychological one, diffusing tension and reinforcing trust. These moments, seemingly minor, were vital. They preserved focus, nurtured resilience, and strengthened the invisible bonds connecting each man to the others, ensuring that even under fire, the squad remained a cohesive, functioning unit. Nightfall offered no reprieve from vigilance. Fires were guarded, patrols conducted, and shadows scrutinized. Sleep, fragmented and uneasy, was stolen in shifts. Dreams interwove memory, fear, and anticipation. Each decision, where to post guards, when to rest, how to arrange equipment, was layered with consequence. Leadership, I realized more acutely with each passing day, existed not in dramatic commands but in countless small, deliberate actions that shaped perception, morale, and survival. By the end of these initial engagements, I understood profoundly that the role of squad leader was both tactical and profoundly human. Every gesture, order, and observation rippled through the unit, influencing outcomes visible and invisible. The delicate balance of authority, empathy, vigilance, and intuition became the scaffolding upon which survival rested. In every glance, every nod, every shared ration or whispered story, the essence of leadership manifested, sustaining not just the mission but the men who entrusted their lives to it. The days that followed the initial skirmishes blurred into a relentless rhythm of preparation, engagement, and reflection. Every morning began before the sun had fully risen, the sky a pale wash of gray, and the land cloaked in mist that seemed to obscure both opportunity and danger. Orders arrived from higher command, often vague or conflicting, and it fell to me to interpret them in a way that preserved the squad's effectiveness and safety. Each decision was a delicate balance of caution, aggression, and intuition, with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. Patrolling became an intricate exercise in awareness. Every footstep, every snap of a twig, every movement in the underbrush had to be scrutinized. We learned to anticipate patterns in enemy behavior, reading subtle cues in terrain and vegetation that might indicate ambushes or patrols. Sometimes these cues were obvious only after repeated observation. Disturbed leaves, displaced soil, the faint odor of smoke or fire, and interpreting them correctly could mean the difference between survival and disaster. I paired men according to complementary skills, one with sharp observational instincts, another with steady nerves and quick reflexes. These partnerships often determined success in reconnaissance missions. Food, as ever, remained both practical necessity and a subtle form of morale. Rations were often meager, yet we turned even small finds into meaningful meals. A handful of dried beans, combined with scavenged vegetables, could be transformed into stew. A single loaf of bread divided carefully became a celebration. Cooking over makeshift fires offered a brief ritual of normalcy, and moments of shared laughter while preparing meals reinforced the invisible bonds that held the squad together. Even minor indulgences, a sliver of chocolate, a tin of fruit, became sources of collective joy and temporary relief from the surrounding chaos. Rumors circulated more freely than ever, fueled by the tension of combat and the imagination of exhausted men. Tales of enemy maneuvers, phantom snipers, and miraculous rescues spread quickly, often morphing with each retelling. I learned to navigate these stories carefully, allowing them to bolster vigilance without letting fear dominate. Sometimes, the whispered legends provided subtle psychological advantages, keeping men alert and cautious while simultaneously sustaining morale. These narratives became invisible tools, shaping perception and behavior in ways no formal instruction could replicate. Reconnaissance missions grew more demanding and dangerous. Moving ahead of the main unit required not only physical endurance, but mental acuity. Every rustle, shadow, or shift in terrain was analyzed for potential threat. Patrols moved silently, constantly aware that a single misstep could have catastrophic consequences. Observation became instinctual, noticing the tilt of a wall, a disturbed patch of ground, or the faintest footprint. These details informed tactical decisions and ensured that the squad could act with a combination of caution and aggression appropriate to the situation. Letters from home remained a precious lifeline. Even a single line from a loved one could shift moods, restore focus, or inspire courage. I observed men reading in quiet corners, their expressions softening, tension easing, laughter occasionally escaping despite the surrounding turmoil. Protecting these connections became part of leadership. Ensuring privacy, preserving the integrity of correspondence, and allowing time to absorb words from home helped maintain morale and a sense of humanity that war constantly threatened to erode. Fatigue was an ever-present adversary, manifesting subtly in hesitation, slowness, or lapses in attention. Observing these signs, I adjusted assignments, rotations, and watched schedules. Leadership required careful judgment, knowing when to push for discipline and when to allow reprieve. Small gestures, a reassuring word, acknowledgement of hardship, or even brief humor, often stabilized the squad more effectively than any order. Balancing mental, emotional, and physical endurance became a constant preoccupation, and I realized that success depended as much on sustaining human spirit as on executing strategy. Interactions within the squad continued to shape daily life. Bonds strengthened through shared labor, humor, and mutual support, but tension never disappeared entirely. Disputes over rations, space, or perceived slights were inevitable, yet subtle mediation preserved cohesion. Observing reactions to stress, I adjusted expectations, paired men strategically, and used humor or distraction to defuse conflict. Trust, once earned, became a vital tool, enabling cooperation under pressure and ensuring the squad remained functional despite the relentless challenges. Nature remained an indifferent but persistent adversary. Sudden storms transformed paths into rivers, mud slowed progress, and the terrain itself seemed designed to test resolve. Each environmental element influenced tactical decisions, from movement and formation to timing and positioning. Observation of these factors became second nature. We learned to anticipate changes in weather, assess the stability of terrain, and interpret natural cues as part of the strategic landscape. Even minor successes, like navigating treacherous ground without incident, became points of collective pride and subtle celebration. Games and informal competitions persisted as crucial mental exercises. Races across uneven fields, challenges in aim, or contests of observation kept focus sharp, reinforced camaraderie, and encouraged resilience. Laughter, though fleeting, released tension and reinforced trust. These diversions, while seemingly trivial, were essential. They strengthened coordination, mental agility, and emotional stability, ensuring the squad could perform effectively under extreme stress. Nightfall brought no relief from vigilance. Fires were tended carefully, patrols moved silently, and shadows carried hidden threats. Sleep was fragmented, taken in shifts, often under minimal cover, and dreams mingled memory with anticipation and fear. Decisions, where to position guards, when to rest, how to arrange supplies, were laden with consequences. Leadership, I realized more acutely each day, was defined not by dramatic gestures but by countless small, deliberate actions shaping perception, morale, and survival. By the end of these intense days, I understood that command required a synthesis of observation, intuition, empathy, and decisiveness. Every act, whether issuing orders, sharing a ration, or offering quiet reassurance, contributed to a delicate framework that sustained not only operational success but the human spirit. Leadership was both a science and an art, balancing strategy, psychology, and endurance in a world where every moment carried the potential for triumph or catastrophe. The following days carried a different kind of tension, a sense of expectation that lingered like a low fog over the squad. Each dawn seemed to arrive with a question: what challenges would the terrain, the enemy, or unforeseen circumstance present today? The men moved with quiet precision, yet their eyes betrayed the undercurrent of anxiety that never fully dissipated. I found myself reading each subtle cue, the tightening of a jaw, a flicker of hesitation, a momentary glance toward the horizon, and adjusting orders, pairings, and pace accordingly. Leadership, I realized, was less about authority and more about constant calibration, balancing the physical, mental, and emotional states of each man while maintaining operational cohesion. The following days carried a different kind of tension, a sense of expectation that lingered like a low fog over the squad. Each dawn seemed to arrive with a question: what challenges would the terrain, the enemy, or unforeseen circumstance present today? The men moved with quiet precision, yet their eyes betrayed the undercurrent of anxiety that never fully dissipated. I found myself reading each subtle cue, the tightening of a jaw, a flicker of hesitation, a momentary glance toward the horizon, and adjusting orders, pairings, and pace accordingly. Leadership, I realized, was less about authority and more about constant calibration, balancing the physical, mental, and emotional states of each man while maintaining operational cohesion. Our encounters with the enemy became more frequent and unpredictable. skirmishes erupted with little warning, forcing immediate adaptation and rapid decision-making. I learned to rely not only on training but on intuition honed over countless hours of observation. Every maneuver, from positioning men to managing fields of fire, had to be precise yet flexible. Miscalculations carried immediate consequences, and I felt the weight of responsibility in every choice, knowing that hesitation or error could result in injury or death. Yet even amid this intensity, subtle rituals persisted. Men exchanged nods of reassurance, shared water or rations, and offered brief words of encouragement. Tiny acts that bolstered morale and reinforced the invisible bonds sustaining the unit. Food continued to serve as both necessity and solace. Rations were often stretched thin, and scavenged ingredients became essential for creating meals that nourished both body and spirit. Cooking over a fire, even in brief intervals, offered a momentary return to normalcy. Shared laughter while preparing simple dishes became an unspoken ritual, a reaffirmation of connection and humanity. Even the smallest indulgences, a sliver of chocolate, a scrap of preserved meat, transformed into sources of collective joy, reinforcing cohesion and resilience. Rumors, as ever, shaped perception and behavior. Tales of enemy ambushes, unlikely rescues, or phantom sightings spread quickly, sometimes amplified by fear or fatigue. I learned to navigate these currents, allowing imagination to heighten vigilance while preventing panic from taking hold. Each story, whether grounded in truth or not, influenced how men moved, watched, and interacted. I discovered that managing perception was as critical to survival as managing logistics or executing strategy. These invisible narratives became tools of leadership, guiding attention, caution, and morale in subtle yet profound ways. Reconnaissance missions grew increasingly complex. Scouts moved ahead in pairs, silent and deliberate, analyzing terrain, vegetation, and movement for signs of the enemy. I paired men carefully, balancing complementary skills such as sharp observation, calm composure, and quick reaction times. Every rustle of leaves, shadow, or glint of metal became a potential clue. Success depended on observation, anticipation, and instinctive judgment. A single misstep could compromise safety, yet the careful cultivation of awareness allowed the squad to move with measured confidence despite the uncertainty. Letters from home retained their almost sacred significance. Even brief correspondence could shift mood, restore focus, or inspire courage. I observed men reading in quiet moments, their expressions softening, shoulders relaxing, and brief smiles emerging. Protecting access to these letters became part of my responsibility, preserving a vital psychological lifeline. These simple connections anchored hope, providing a sense of continuity and humanity that contrasted sharply with the chaos surrounding us. Fatigue continued to test endurance, manifesting in subtle ways: hesitation before an order, slight slowness in movement, or diminished focus. Observing these signs informed rotations, rest schedules, and assignment adjustments. Leadership required constant attention to both the collective and individual states of the squad. Moments of empathy, a word of reassurance, acknowledgement of effort, or brief shared humor, often stabilized morale more effectively than strict enforcement of orders. The balance of mental, emotional, and physical management became the cornerstone of effective command. Interaction within the squad remained intricate and essential. Bonds strengthened through shared labor, humor, and mutual support, yet tension never disappeared entirely. Minor disputes were inevitable, requiring subtle mediation and strategic attention. Observing reactions to stress and challenge allowed me to adjust pairings, anticipate conflicts, and employ humor or distraction to maintain cohesion. Trust, once cultivated, proved invaluable, enabling coordination and resilience under relentless pressure. The natural environment continued to influence every decision. Sudden storms transformed paths into rivers, mud slowed movement, and terrain itself presented constant challenges. Weather, light, and ground conditions dictated tactical adjustments, influencing formations, timing, and pacing. We learned to read these variables instinctively, interpreting them as critical elements of the battlefield. Even small successes, navigating treacherous ground without incident, were celebrated quietly, reinforcing morale and reinforcing the perception of agency in a world dominated by unpredictability. Games and informal contests persisted as subtle but vital tools. Races across fields, competitions in accuracy, or challenges of observation kept focus sharp and fostered camaraderie. Brief moments of laughter released tension, reinforced trust, and strengthened invisible bonds that allowed the squad to function effectively under extreme stress. These activities, though seemingly minor, were essential for maintaining cohesion, alertness, and resilience in an environment that demanded constant vigilance. Nightfall brought renewed challenges. Fires were carefully tended, patrols moved silently, and shadows became potential threats. Sleep was fragmented and never guaranteed, taken in shifts under minimal cover, with dreams weaving memory, anticipation, and fear into a surreal tapestry. Every choice, where to position guards, when to allow rest, how to arrange supplies, carried profound consequences. Leadership, I realized more acutely each day, existed not in grand gestures but in countless small, deliberate actions shaping morale, perception, and survival. By the end of these relentless days, it became clear that the role of a squad leader was an intricate blend of strategy, observation, and emotional intelligence. Every gesture, order, and interaction contributed to a delicate structure sustaining not only operational success but the human spirit itself. Leadership was both science and art, requiring constant adaptation, empathy, and vigilance in a world where every moment could redefine life, death, or endurance. The 10th day of our relentless march arrived with the weight of both anticipation and exhaustion pressing heavily upon every man. Dawn revealed a landscape scarred by prior engagements, trenches partially collapsed, earth churned into mud, and the skeletal remains of buildings looming as reminders of battles past. The squad moved cautiously, each footstep deliberate, every movement layered with instinct and experience. The tension was palpable, yet beneath it, a quiet rhythm persisted. Men adjusted gear, exchanged brief words, and shared glances of unspoken understanding. Leadership demanded constant attention, balancing the physical condition of the unit with the invisible threads of morale and cohesion. Engagements with the enemy had grown more unpredictable, requiring rapid adaptation. I observed how each soldier responded under pressure. Some reacted with calm precision, others with hesitation that needed gentle correction, and a few with instinctive brilliance that exceeded expectation. Every maneuver, from positioning to timing, carried immediate consequences, and I found myself making split-second judgments that relied as much on intuition as training. Leadership became an exercise in continuous calculation, weighing risks, reading the environment, and anticipating both enemy behavior and the squad's responses. Rations were scarce, and yet we discovered ways to stretch them into meaningful sustenance. Simple ingredients, a few dried vegetables, scraps of preserved meat, a handful of beans, were transformed into meals that nourished body and spirit. Cooking became ritualized, tending fires, chopping, stirring, and sharing tasks offered moments of normalcy amidst chaos. Laughter occasionally punctuated the work, softening the harsh edges of reality. Even small indulgences, a scrap of chocolate, a tin of fruit, a sip of coffee, became treasured symbols of comfort and a shared reminder of life beyond the battlefield. Rumors evolved rapidly, often inflating with each telling. Tales of enemy movements, ambushes, or legendary feats circulated among the squad, influencing behavior and mindset. I learned to manage these narratives carefully, allowing imagination to enhance vigilance while preventing fear from disrupting cohesion. These stories, whispered in tents or around fires, became part of the invisible battlefield, shaping perception, decision-making, and readiness in subtle yet significant ways. Reconnaissance missions demanded heightened attention and caution. Scouts moved ahead in pairs, blending observation with stealth, their senses attuned to the faintest clues, footprints in mud, subtle changes in vegetation, the distant echo of movement. Every detail carried significance. Pairings were deliberate, one with keen observation, the other with calm composure under stress. Success depended on careful coordination, quick interpretation of environmental cues, and instinctive judgment. A single misstep could compromise safety, yet careful observation allowed the squad to move with measured confidence despite the ever-present risk. Letters from home continued to serve as emotional lifelines. Even the briefest message could transform mood, restore focus, or inspire determination. I watched soldiers read with softened expressions, relaxed shoulders, or brief smiles that contrasted sharply with the surrounding tension. Protecting these connections became a subtle but critical aspect of leadership, ensuring that fragile threads of hope and humanity remained intact. These letters anchored morale and provided perspective, a glimpse of the world beyond the battlefield's relentless demands. Fatigue manifested in subtle yet telling ways: hesitation before executing a command, a slight slump in posture, or diminished alertness during routine tasks. Observing these signs informed decisions regarding rotation, rest, and task allocation. Leadership required constant judgment, balancing the need for discipline with empathy and understanding. Small gestures, a word of reassurance, acknowledgement of effort, or a brief shared joke, often stabilized morale more effectively than strict enforcement of orders. Maintaining mental, emotional, and physical equilibrium was as vital as any strategic maneuver. Interactions within the squad continued to shape daily life. Bonds were reinforced through shared labor, humor, and mutual support, yet tension never vanished entirely. Minor disputes, over rations, personal space, or perceived slights, required careful attention and mediation. Observing individual responses to stress informed tactical decisions, pairings, and subtle interventions. Trust, once cultivated, proved essential, enabling coordination, resilience, and adaptability under relentless pressure. The natural environment remained an omnipresent factor, influencing every decision. Sudden storms transformed routes into treacherous mud, shifting light altered perception, and uneven terrain demanded constant attention. These elements shaped tactics, timing, and movement. Observation of environmental cues became instinctive, and even minor successes, navigating challenging terrain without incident, were quietly celebrated, reinforcing morale and the perception of control in a world dominated by uncertainty. Informal competitions and games persisted as subtle but crucial tools. Races across fields, target challenges, or observation contests maintained mental sharpness, fostered camaraderie, and bolstered resilience. Moments of laughter, though fleeting, released tension and reinforced trust. These activities, while seemingly minor, were vital for maintaining cohesion, alertness, and performance under extreme stress. They allowed the squad to function effectively even as the relentless demands of warfare threatened to erode focus and spirit. Nightfall offered no respite. Fires were carefully tended, patrols moved with deliberate caution, and shadows carried potential threats. Sleep, fragmented and uneasy, was taken in shifts, often under minimal cover, and dreams interwove memory, anticipation, and fear. Every decision, where to place guards, when to rest, how to organize supplies, carried weight. Leadership, I realized with increasing clarity, existed not in grand gestures but in countless small, deliberate actions that shaped perception, morale, and the squad's capacity to endure. By the end of this period, the cumulative weight of command was undeniable. Every gesture, order, and observation contributed to a delicate framework that sustained both operational effectiveness and human spirit. Leadership was a synthesis of strategy, psychology, and endurance, demanding vigilance, empathy, and adaptability in a world where every moment could redefine survival. In each glance, shared ration, whispered instruction, or quiet reassurance, the essence of command revealed itself, sustaining not only the mission but the men who entrusted their lives to it. The days that followed carried an intensity that seemed almost unrelenting, as though the landscape itself conspired to test our endurance. Each dawn brought a muted light filtering through overcast skies, casting a somber hue across scarred terrain. Movement became both ritual and necessity. The squad navigated carefully, boots sinking into mud, eyes scanning for the faintest disturbances, ears attuned to sounds that might signify either friend or foe. Leadership demanded constant vigilance, not just over the mission but over the fragile equilibrium of the men themselves, their fatigue, fear, and the subtle currents of tension and trust that ran through every interaction. Combat had evolved into a series of rapid, unpredictable encounters. Skirmishes erupted with little warning, forcing instantaneous adaptation. I learned to rely not only on training but on the cumulative intuition developed through observation. The flicker of hesitation in a soldier's movements, the subtle shift in enemy posture, the telltale disturbance of foliage in the wind. Every decision, where to position men, when to advance, when to hold, carried immediate consequences. Orders were shouted, gestures used when sound failed, and eyes scanned continuously for the smallest signs of opportunity or threat. Leadership was no longer an abstract responsibility, it was a constant, pressing reality, immediate and total. Even in the chaos of engagement, small acts of humanity persisted. Soldiers shared water, adjusted gear for one another, or exchanged brief words of encouragement. These gestures, seemingly trivial, were vital. They reinforced morale, strengthened trust, and reminded us all that amid the violence and uncertainty, the human connections that bound us together could not be abandoned. I observed how these microactions often determined behavior under stress, fostering cohesion that sustained both performance and spirit. Rations remained scarce and precious. We stretched supplies, transforming small portions into meals that nourished both body and morale. Simple combinations, a few dried vegetables with scraps of preserved meat, or beans stewed over a small fire, became moments of ritual, a brief reclaiming of normalcy. Laughter occasionally punctuated these moments, a fleeting but potent balm against the backdrop of relentless stress. Even the smallest indulgences, a tin of fruit, a piece of chocolate, a sip of coffee, were treasured, symbols of comfort and fleeting joy. Rumors continued to circulate, shaping perceptions and behavior in ways both subtle and profound. Stories of enemy maneuvers, sudden retreats, or extraordinary acts of bravery spread quickly, gaining detail and color with each retelling. I learned to manage these currents carefully, allowing imagination to heighten vigilance while preventing fear from fracturing cohesion. These whispered narratives became invisible instruments of strategy, influencing alertness, preparedness, and morale in ways no formal order could achieve. Reconnaissance missions demanded acute attention and coordination. Scouts moved in pairs, blending observation with stealth, attuned to subtle environmental cues, the faintest footprints in mud, the shifting of leaves, the echo of distant sounds. Every detail mattered. Pairings were deliberate, designed to combine complementary skills, keen perception, calm under pressure, rapid reflexes. Success depended on observation, anticipation, and instinctive judgment. One miscalculation could compromise safety, yet the careful cultivation of awareness allowed the squad to navigate dangerous terrain with measured confidence. Letters from home remained lifelines, providing emotional sustenance that rivaled even the most necessary rations. A single note could lift spirits, restore focus, or inspire courage. I observed men reading quietly, shoulders relaxing, tension easing, a faint smile appearing even amid exhaustion. Protecting access to these letters became part of my responsibilities. These fragile connections anchored hope, offering a glimpse of the world beyond the battlefield and sustaining a sense of humanity in a life dominated by survival. Fatigue manifested in subtle ways: hesitation, slowed reactions, fleeting irritability. Observing these signs informed rotation schedules, task allocation, and the pacing of activity. Leadership required judgment, balancing the enforcement of discipline with empathy and understanding. A quiet word, acknowledgement of effort, or brief shared humor often stabilized morale more effectively than any strict directive. The management of physical, mental, and emotional endurance became as critical as any tactical decision, forming the foundation upon which survival depended. Interactions within the squad shaped every aspect of life. Bonds were strengthened through shared labor, humor, and mutual support, yet tension remained ever present. Minor disputes, over rations, personal space, or perceived slights, required careful attention. observing how soldiers responded to stress-informed pairings, tactical choices, and subtle interventions. Trust, once cultivated, proved invaluable, enabling coordination, resilience, and adaptability in an environment that demanded constant vigilance. Nature continued to impose its will. Sudden storms transformed paths into treacherous mud, shadows shifted unpredictably with changing light, and uneven terrain challenged both endurance and strategy. Observation of environmental cues became instinctive, informing movement, timing, and tactical positioning. Even small victories, navigating hazardous terrain without mishap, were quietly celebrated, reinforcing morale and confidence. Games and informal contests persisted, subtle yet essential. Races across fields, challenges of aim, or exercises in observation maintained sharpness, cohesion, and resilience. Moments of laughter, though rare, released tension and reinforced trust, reminding the squad that even amid relentless stress, human connection and joy could survive. These activities strengthened coordination, mental agility, and emotional fortitude, ensuring operational effectiveness under extreme pressure. Nightfall brought renewed vigilance. Fires were tended cautiously, patrols moved silently, and shadows carried hidden threats. Sleep, fragmented and uneasy, was taken in shifts under minimal cover, with dreams interweaving memory, fear, and anticipation. Every decision, where to post guards, when to rest, how to organize supplies, carried weight. Leadership existed not in grand gestures but in countless deliberate acts that shaped morale, perception, and the squad's capacity to endure. By this point, the cumulative weight of command was unmistakable. Every gesture, every order, and every observation contributed to a delicate framework that sustained operational effectiveness and human spirit. Leadership was a synthesis of strategy, psychology, and endurance, requiring constant vigilance, empathy, and adaptability in a world where each moment could redefine survival. In the quiet exchange of glance, the sharing of a ration, or the whispered instruction of reassurance, the essence of command revealed itself, sustaining both mission and men alike. The rhythm of war, once measured in the slow cadence of preparation and reconnaissance, had accelerated into a relentless pulse that left little room for reflection or ease. Dawn arrived with a fragile light filtering through clouds, casting muted shadows over scarred terrain. Each man moved with deliberate attention, boots sinking into churned earth, eyes scanning for the faintest disturbances, ears attuned to the slightest sounds that could signify danger. Leadership demanded vigilance at every level, not only for tactical precision but for the subtle dynamics of trust, morale, and endurance that ran like an invisible current through the squad. Combat had become a constant, shifting challenge. Skirmishes erupted suddenly, forcing instant adaptation. Observing the reactions of my men, I noted who moved with calm precision, who hesitated, and who displayed flashes of instinctive brilliance. Every choice, where to position men, when to advance, when to hold, was a matter of life and death. Orders were shouted over gunfire, gestures substituted for words when the roar of battle drowned out commands, and eyes remained alert for the smallest clue that could indicate opportunity or threat. Leadership had transformed into a continuous, pressing reality that was immediate, total, and unforgiving. Even amid the chaos, small gestures of humanity persisted. Soldiers shared water, adjusted gear for one another, offered brief words of encouragement, and sometimes, in fleeting moments, shared a smile or quiet laughter. These micro-actions, seemingly insignificant, were vital. They reinforced morale, strengthened trust, and reminded each of us that amid destruction and fear, the human connections that bound the squad together remained essential. I observed how these subtle interactions could dictate performance under pressure, sustaining cohesion and preserving the delicate balance necessary for survival. Food remained both necessity and ritual. Rations were sparse, yet we managed to stretch them into meals that nourished body and spirit. Simple combinations, a few dried vegetables stewed with scraps of meat, beans simmered over embers, a bit of bread divided carefully among the squad, became acts of sustenance and psychological reassurance. Preparing and sharing meals created brief moments of normalcy. Laughter occasionally broke through the tension as men joked quietly while tending fires, transforming a small task into an unspoken affirmation of resilience. Even minor indulgences, a slice of chocolate, a tin of fruit, a sip of coffee, became treasured symbols of comfort, a reminder that life beyond the battlefield persisted in memory and hope. Rumors circulated with greater intensity, fueled by fear, imagination, and fragmented observation. Stories of enemy ambushes, phantom movements, and improbable rescues spread quickly, evolving with each retelling. I learned to navigate these narratives carefully, allowing them to heighten vigilance without letting anxiety fracture cohesion. These whispered tales became tools of perception management, shaping alertness, readiness, and morale in subtle but significant ways. They created an invisible battlefield of the mind, where belief and anticipation influenced behavior as much as any direct order. Reconnaissance missions became more perilous. Scouts moved ahead in carefully chosen pairs, combining observation, stealth, and instinct. Every detail mattered: a disturbed patch of ground, a bent branch, the glint of metal in shadow. I paired men to complement each other's skills, one with sharp perception, the other with calm nerves and rapid reflexes. Success depended on precision, anticipation, and trust, as a single misstep could compromise safety or mission objectives. Observation became second nature, integrated into every movement, glance, and breath, providing the squad with the subtle advantages that allowed us to navigate dangerous terrain with cautious confidence. Letters from home remained vital lifelines. Even the briefest note could lift spirits, restore focus, or instill renewed determination. I watched soldiers reading quietly in corners, shoulders relaxing, expressions softening, a faint smile breaking through exhaustion. Protecting these connections became part of my duties, ensuring that fragile threads of hope and normalcy remained intact. These letters were more than communication, they were anchors of humanity, offering reassurance and continuity in a world dominated by uncertainty and danger. Fatigue exerted its influence subtly but pervasively. Hesitation, slowed reflexes, or fleeting irritability became signs to adjust rotations, rest periods, and task assignments. Leadership required discernment: when to enforce discipline, when to allow reprieve, when a quiet word or brief gesture of acknowledgement could stabilize morale. Managing physical, mental, and emotional endurance was as crucial as any tactical maneuver, forming the backbone of effective command and the foundation of survival. Interactions within the squad were both a source of strength and occasional friction. Bonds were reinforced through shared labor, humor, and mutual support, yet minor disputes were inevitable. Observing reactions to stress informed decisions about pairings, tactical placement, and intervention strategies. Trust, once cultivated, proved indispensable, enabling coordinated action, resilience, and adaptability under relentless pressure. The balance of authority, empathy, and guidance became the invisible scaffolding holding the unit together. Nature remained an indifferent adversary. Sudden storms turned pathways into quagmires, shifting light altered perception, and uneven terrain tested endurance and tactical planning. Observing environmental cues became instinctual, informing movement, timing, and decision-making. Even minor successes, crossing hazardous ground without mishap, were quietly celebrated, reinforcing morale and a sense of agency in a world dominated by unpredictability. Informal competitions and games persisted as subtle but essential tools. Quick races, aim challenges, and exercises in observation maintained alertness, mental acuity, and cohesion. Laughter, brief but potent, released tension and reinforced trust. These activities, though seemingly minor, strengthened coordination, resilience, and mental fortitude, ensuring the squad could function effectively under extreme stress. Nightfall demanded renewed vigilance. Fires were carefully monitored, patrols moved silently, and shadows were treated as potential threats. Sleep, fragmented and uneasy, was stolen in shifts under minimal cover, with dreams interweaving memory, anticipation, and fear. Every choice, where to position guards, when to rest, how to organize supplies, was weighted with consequence. Leadership revealed itself in countless deliberate acts, each shaping morale, perception, and the squad's capacity to endure. By the end of these intense days, the cumulative burden of command had crystallized. Every gesture, order, and observation contributed to a delicate framework that sustained both operational effectiveness and human spirit. Leadership was an intricate synthesis of strategy, observation, and empathy, requiring constant adaptation, vigilance, and understanding in a world where every moment could redefine survival. In shared rations, whispered instructions, and quiet exchanges of trust, the essence of command manifested, sustaining both mission and men. The days grew heavier, each one layering exhaustion upon the last, creating a rhythm of life dictated by vigilance, survival, and the unspoken understanding that any misstep could prove fatal. Dawn arrived with muted light, casting a pall over the scarred landscape, and the squad moved in careful formation, boots sinking into churned mud, eyes scanning every shadow, ears straining to catch the faintest shift in the wind or rustle of leaves. Leadership demanded unceasing attention, the management of the mission, yes, but also the delicate balance of morale, fatigue, and trust that underpinned every interaction and decision. Combat became increasingly chaotic and unpredictable. Skirmishes erupted with no warning, forcing rapid adaptation and instant decision-making. Observing my men, I noted who reacted with steady precision, who faltered in hesitation, and who displayed flashes of instinctive brilliance that could turn a moment of peril into survival. Every decision, whether to advance, hold, or maneuver, was laden with immediate consequence. Commands were shouted over gunfire, gestures substituted when sound failed, and eyes continuously scanned for the smallest clues that could indicate either threat or opportunity. Leadership was no longer an abstract responsibility. It was a pressing, immediate, and total reality that permeated every action. Amid the chaos, small acts of human connection persisted. Soldiers shared water, offered rations, adjusted one another's gear, and sometimes exchanged brief words of encouragement. These gestures, though minor, were essential. They reinforced trust, strengthened morale, and reminded us all that even in the midst of violence, human connection could not be abandoned. I realized that these micro-actions often dictated performance under pressure, sustaining cohesion and offering subtle but powerful reinforcement of the squad's collective will. Rations remained scarce, and ingenuity became crucial. We stretched small portions into meals that nourished body and spirit. Dried vegetables combined with scraps of meat, beans stewed over embers, and a small loaf of bread divided carefully became ritualized acts, moments that temporarily reclaimed normalcy. Laughter, brief and rare, punctuated these tasks, transforming them into quiet affirmations of resilience. Even the smallest indulgences, a tin of fruit, a scrap of chocolate, a sip of coffee, were treasured symbols of comfort, brief reminders of life beyond the battlefield. Rumors and whispers circulated constantly, shaping perception and behavior in subtle but significant ways. Tales of enemy movements, ambushes, or extraordinary feats spread quickly, evolving with each retelling. I learned to navigate these narratives carefully, allowing imagination to enhance vigilance without letting fear fracture cohesion. These stories became invisible instruments of strategy, influencing alertness, readiness, and morale in ways formal orders could not replicate. They created an unseen layer of the battlefield, where perception and anticipation influenced behavior as decisively as any direct encounter. Reconnaissance missions became more complex and dangerous. Scouts moved ahead in pairs, blending stealth, observation, and intuition. Every detail mattered, the slightest shift in vegetation, a footprint, the glint of metal. Pairings were deliberate, balancing complementary skills, keen perception with calm composure, rapid reflexes with steady nerves. Success relied on observation, anticipation, and instinctive judgment. A single misstep could compromise safety, yet careful attention allowed the squad to navigate difficult terrain with measured confidence and strategic advantage. Letters from home retained their profound significance. Even a brief note could shift mood, restore focus, or instill renewed determination. I watched soldiers read quietly, their expressions softening, shoulders easing, a faint smile appearing even amid fatigue and stress. Protecting these connections became part of my duties. These fragile links anchored hope, offering a glimpse of a life beyond the battlefield and sustaining humanity in an environment dominated by uncertainty and danger. Fatigue pressed constantly against both body and mind. Hesitation, slowed reflexes, and minor irritability became cues to adjust rotations, redistribute tasks, or allow brief rest. Leadership required discernment, balancing the enforcement of discipline with empathy and understanding. A quiet word, acknowledgement of effort, or fleeting humor could stabilize morale more effectively than any rigid command. Managing the mental, emotional, and physical endurance of the squad became as vital as tactical precision, forming the foundation for both survival and operational success. Interactions within the squad shaped every aspect of life. Bonds were strengthened through shared labor, humor, and mutual support, yet tension never disappeared entirely. Minor disputes, over rations, personal space, or perceived slights, required careful attention and intervention. Observing reactions to stress informed decisions about pairings, placement, and subtle guidance. Trust, once cultivated, proved essential, enabling coordinated action, resilience, and adaptability under unrelenting pressure. The balance of authority, empathy, and guidance became the invisible scaffolding sustaining the squad. Nature remained an omnipresent adversary. Storms turned paths to quagmires, shifting light altered perception, and uneven terrain tested endurance and strategy alike. Observation of environmental cues became instinctive, informing timing, movement, and tactical decisions. Even minor victories, crossing hazardous ground without mishap, were quietly celebrated, reinforcing morale and a sense of control in a world dominated by unpredictability. Informal competitions and exercises persisted as subtle but essential tools. Quick races, marksmanship challenges, and observation exercises maintained alertness, cohesion, and mental sharpness. Laughter, brief but potent, released tension and reinforced trust. These activities, though seemingly minor, strengthened coordination, resilience, and emotional fortitude, ensuring operational effectiveness despite constant stress. Nightfall demanded renewed vigilance. Fires were carefully monitored, patrols moved silently, and shadows were treated as potential threats. Sleep, fragmented and uneasy, was taken in shifts under minimal cover, dreams interweaving memory, anticipation, and fear. Every decision, where to post guards, when to rest, how to arrange supplies, was weighted with consequence. Leadership existed in countless deliberate actions that shaped morale, perception, and endurance, often invisible yet profoundly consequential. The morning light arrived filtered and gray, the landscape muted as if the earth itself were exhausted by the endless rhythm of conflict. Each member of the squad moved with deliberate precision, boots sinking into the churned earth, eyes scanning every shadow, ears tuned to the faintest rustle or distant sound. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on me. Leadership had become a ceaseless vigilance, a combination of tactical judgment, psychological awareness, and the careful calibration of human endurance. Every glance, every word, every adjustment could influence both survival and cohesion. Combat had grown increasingly unpredictable. Ambushes and skirmishes appeared suddenly, demanding immediate adaptation. I observed how each soldier responded, some with the steady precision of trained reflex, others with fleeting hesitation that required gentle correction, and a few with flashes of instinctive brilliance that could turn imminent danger into survival. Every decision, when to advance, when to hold, how to maneuver, was laden with immediate consequence. Orders were shouted, gestures substituted for words, eyes constantly scanned for even the smallest sign of threat or opportunity. Leadership had become a continuous, all-encompassing task, executed in real time under constant pressure. Even amid this chaos, small gestures of humanity persisted. Men shared water and rations, adjusted each other's gear, offered brief words of encouragement, and sometimes allowed a fleeting smile or chuckle to slip through. These seemingly minor actions carried immense weight. They reinforced trust, strengthened morale, and reminded us that despite the violence and uncertainty, human connection could not be neglected. I recognized how these microactions often dictated performance under stress, subtly fortifying cohesion and collective resilience. Rations remained sparse, requiring ingenuity and careful management. Simple meals: a few dried vegetables with scraps of meat, beans simmered over embers, a bit of bread divided carefully, were transformed into rituals of sustenance. Preparing and sharing food became moments of normalcy, opportunities to strengthen camaraderie and morale. Even the smallest indulgences, a tin of fruit, a scrap of chocolate, a sip of coffee, were treasured, symbols of comfort, ephemeral reminders of life beyond the battlefield. Laughter, though rare, emerged in these moments, carrying a weight far greater than its brevity suggested. The morning light arrived filtered and gray, the landscape muted as if the earth itself were exhausted by the endless rhythm of conflict. Each member of the squad moved with deliberate precision, boots sinking into the churned earth, eyes scanning every shadow, ears tuned to the faintest rustle or distant sound. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on me. Leadership had become a ceaseless vigilance, a combination of tactical judgment, psychological awareness, and the careful calibration of human endurance. Every glance, every word, every adjustment could influence both survival and cohesion. Combat had grown increasingly unpredictable. Ambushes and skirmishes appeared suddenly, demanding immediate adaptation. I observed how each soldier responded, some with the steady precision of trained reflex, others with fleeting hesitation that required gentle correction, and a few with flashes of instinctive brilliance that could turn imminent danger into survival. Every decision, when to advance, when to hold, how to maneuver, was laden with immediate consequence. Orders were shouted, gestures substituted for words, eyes constantly scanned for even the smallest sign of threat or opportunity. Leadership had become a continuous, all-encompassing task, executed in real time under constant pressure. Even amid this chaos, small gestures of humanity persisted. Men shared water and rations, adjusted each other's gear, offered brief words of encouragement, and sometimes allowed a fleeting smile or chuckle to slip through. These seemingly minor actions carried immense weight. They reinforced trust, strengthened morale, and reminded us that despite the violence and uncertainty, human connection could not be neglected. I recognized how these microactions often dictated performance under stress, subtly fortifying cohesion and collective resilience. Rations remained sparse, requiring ingenuity and careful management. Simple meals: a few dried vegetables with scraps of meat, beans simmered over embers, a bit of bread divided carefully, were transformed into rituals of sustenance. Preparing and sharing food became moments of normalcy, opportunities to strengthen camaraderie and morale. Even the smallest indulgences, a tin of fruit, a scrap of chocolate, a sip of coffee, were treasured, symbols of comfort, ephemeral reminders of life beyond the battlefield. Laughter, though rare, emerged in these moments, carrying a weight far greater than its brevity suggested. Rumors and whispers continued to shape perception and behavior. Stories of enemy movements, sudden retreats, or heroic feats spread rapidly, evolving with each retelling. I learned to navigate these narratives carefully, allowing imagination to heighten vigilance while ensuring fear did not fracture cohesion. These whispered stories became invisible instruments of strategy, shaping alertness, readiness, and morale in ways no formal directive could achieve. They created an unseen layer of conflict where perception and anticipation influenced outcomes as powerfully as any physical engagement. Reconnaissance missions grew ever more demanding. Scouts moved in pairs, combining observation, stealth, and rapid interpretation of subtle environmental cues, footprints, bent branches, faint glints of metal. Pairings were deliberate, balancing complementary abilities, sharp perception with calm composure, instinctive reflex with measured patience. Success relied on acute observation, anticipation, and instinctive judgment. A single misstep could compromise safety, yet careful attention enabled the squad to navigate treacherous terrain with measured confidence. Letters from home remained lifelines, brief yet potent reminders of life beyond the front. Even the smallest note could shift mood, restore focus, or inspire renewed courage. Soldiers read quietly, expressions softening, shoulders easing, a faint smile appearing despite exhaustion. Protecting these fragile connections became an essential part of leadership, ensuring hope and humanity were preserved even in the most trying circumstances. These letters anchored morale, offering reassurance that life outside the battlefield endured, a perspective essential to endurance. Fatigue, both physical and mental, manifested in subtle ways: delayed reactions, hesitation, fleeting irritability. Observing these cues informed rotation schedules, task allocation, and pacing. Leadership required discernment, balancing enforcement of discipline with empathy and understanding. A quiet word, acknowledgement of effort, or brief shared humor often stabilized morale more effectively than strict directives. Managing mental, emotional, and physical endurance was as crucial as tactical decision-making, forming the foundation for both survival and operational success. Interactions within the squad continued to define daily life. Bonds were reinforced through shared labor, humor, and mutual support, yet tension remained inevitable. Minor disputes, over rations, personal space, or perceived slights, required careful attention. Observing reactions to stress informed tactical decisions, pairings, and subtle interventions. Trust, once established, proved indispensable, enabling coordinated action, resilience, and adaptability under relentless pressure. Authority and empathy had to coexist seamlessly, forming the invisible scaffolding that sustained the unit. The natural environment remained a formidable adversary. Sudden storms turned trails into quagmires, shifting light altered perception, and uneven terrain challenged both endurance and strategy. Observation of environmental cues became instinctive, guiding movement, timing, and tactical decisions. Even minor victories, navigating hazardous terrain without mishap, were quietly celebrated, reinforcing morale and the perception of control in a world dominated by uncertainty. Informal competitions and exercises persisted, subtle but essential. Quick races, marksmanship challenges, and observation drills maintained alertness, cohesion, and mental acuity. Laughter, though brief, released tension and reinforced trust. These activities, while appearing minor, strengthened coordination, resilience, and emotional fortitude, ensuring the squad could function effectively under extreme stress. Nightfall demanded renewed vigilance. Fires were carefully monitored, patrols moved silently, and shadows became potential threats. Sleep, fragmented and uneasy, was taken in shifts under minimal cover, dreams weaving memory, fear, and anticipation together. Every decision, where to post guards, when to rest, how to organize supplies, carried weight. Leadership revealed itself in countless deliberate acts, shaping morale, perception, and the squad's capacity to endure. By this stage, the cumulative weight of command was unmistakable. Every gesture, order, and observation contributed to a delicate framework sustaining both operational effectiveness and human spirit. Leadership was a continuous synthesis of strategy, observation, and empathy, requiring constant adaptation, vigilance, and understanding. In quiet gestures, shared rations, and whispered guidance, the essence of command revealed itself, sustaining mission and men alike. The morning arrived with a weight that seemed almost physical, the gray light stretching across a landscape etched with remnants of past battles, torn earth, and shattered structures casting shadows over the advancing squad. Each man moved deliberately, boots sinking into the churned soil, eyes scanning every detail, ears attuned to the faintest shift in the wind or rustle of foliage. The responsibility of command pressed heavily on me. Leadership was no longer a series of decisions but a continuous state of awareness, balancing tactical precision with the subtle currents of fatigue, fear, and trust that defined every interaction. The morning arrived with a weight that seemed almost physical, the gray light stretching across a landscape etched with remnants of past battles, torn earth, and shattered structures casting shadows over the advancing squad. Each man moved deliberately, boots sinking into the churned soil, eyes scanning every detail, ears attuned to the faintest shift in the wind or rustle of foliage. The responsibility of command pressed heavily on me. Leadership was no longer a series of decisions but a continuous state of awareness, balancing tactical precision with the subtle currents of fatigue, fear, and trust that defined every interaction. Combat had grown unpredictable, almost mercurial. Skirmishes erupted suddenly, forcing split-second judgment and immediate adaptation. Observing my men, I noted the subtle differences in reaction. Some moved with the calm precision of rigorous training, others hesitated, needing a word or gesture of encouragement, and a few displayed flashes of instinctive brilliance that could turn imminent peril into survival. Every choice, when to advance, when to hold, how to maneuver, was laden with immediate consequences. Commands were shouted, gestures substituted when sound failed, and eyes scanned constantly for the smallest sign of threat or opportunity. Leadership was all-encompassing, immediate, and continuous, existing not as a concept but as a pressing reality with each heartbeat. Even amid chaos, small acts of humanity persisted. Men shared water and rations, adjusted one another's gear, offered brief words of encouragement, and occasionally, in fleeting moments, allowed themselves a smile or quiet laughter. These micro-actions, seemingly insignificant, carried immense weight. They reinforced trust, strengthened morale, and reminded the squad that even in the midst of danger and uncertainty, human connection was indispensable. Observing how these subtle interactions affected performance, I realized they were as critical as any tactical maneuver, subtly fortifying cohesion and resilience. Food remained sparse, and ingenuity became vital. Simple combinations, dried vegetables with scraps of meat, beans stewed over embers, a small loaf of bread divided carefully, transformed into rituals of sustenance and community. Preparing and sharing meals provided moments of normalcy, occasions to reinforce camaraderie and morale. Even minor indulgences, a tin of fruit, a scrap of chocolate, a sip of coffee, were treasured symbols of comfort, ephemeral reminders of life beyond the battlefield. Laughter, brief and rare, emerged during these moments, its presence disproportionately powerful against the backdrop of tension and exhaustion. Rumors and whispers continued to circulate, shaping perception and behavior in subtle but profound ways. Tales of enemy movements, sudden ambushes, or extraordinary feats spread rapidly, evolving with each retelling. I learned to manage these narratives carefully, allowing imagination to heighten vigilance while preventing fear from fracturing cohesion. These whispered stories became invisible tools of strategy, shaping readiness, alertness, and morale in ways that formal orders could not. They created a mental layer of the battlefield where perception and anticipation could influence outcomes as effectively as any physical engagement. Reconnaissance missions grew increasingly complex and dangerous. Scouts moved ahead in pairs, blending observation, stealth, and intuition. Every detail mattered: a displaced twig, a faint footprint, the glint of metal in shadow. Pairings were deliberate, designed to combine complementary skills. Keen perception with calm composure, instinctive reflex with measured patience. Success relied on acute observation, anticipation, and judgment, as a single misstep could compromise safety or the mission. Careful attention allowed the squad to navigate treacherous terrain with measured confidence, creating subtle advantages essential for survival. Letters from home retained their profound significance. Even a brief note could shift mood, restore focus, or inspire renewed courage. Soldiers read quietly, expressions softening, shoulders easing, a faint smile breaking through fatigue. Protecting these connections became part of my leadership duties, ensuring that fragile threads of hope remained intact. These letters anchored morale, providing reassurance that life outside the battlefield endured, a perspective vital to maintaining human resilience amidst relentless stress. Fatigue, both physical and mental, pressed against the squad constantly. Hesitation, slowed reflexes, fleeting irritability, each was a cue for adjustment, rotation of duties, redistribution of tasks, or brief moments of rest. Leadership demanded discernment, balancing discipline with empathy. A quiet word, acknowledgement of effort, or a brief shared joke could stabilize morale far more effectively than strict command. Managing endurance in all its forms, physical, emotional, and mental, was as crucial as tactical decision-making, forming the foundation for survival and operational effectiveness. Interactions within the squad defined daily life. Bonds were reinforced through shared labor, humor, and mutual support, yet tension remained inevitable. Minor disputes, over rations, personal space, or perceived slights, required careful observation and subtle mediation. Understanding individual responses to stress informed pairings, tactical placement, and interventions. Trust, once cultivated, became indispensable, enabling coordinated action, resilience, and adaptability under relentless pressure. Authority and empathy had to coexist seamlessly, forming the invisible structure that sustained the squad. The natural environment was an unyielding adversary. Storms could turn paths into quagmires, shifting light could alter perception, and uneven terrain tested both endurance and strategy. Observation of environmental cues became instinctive, guiding movement, timing, and tactical decision-making. Even minor victories, traversing hazardous ground without mishap, were quietly celebrated, reinforcing morale and a sense of agency in a world dominated by uncertainty. Informal competitions and exercises persisted, subtle yet essential. Quick races, marksmanship challenges, and observation drills maintained alertness, cohesion, and mental acuity. Laughter, brief but potent, released tension and reinforced trust. These activities, though minor in appearance, strengthened coordination, resilience, and emotional fortitude, ensuring the squad remained functional and effective under extreme stress. Nightfall demanded renewed vigilance. Fires were monitored carefully, patrols moved silently, and shadows were treated as potential threats. Sleep, fragmented and uneasy, was taken in shifts under minimal cover, with dreams intertwining memory, anticipation, and fear. Every decision, where to post guards, when to rest, how to arrange supplies, carried weight. Leadership revealed itself in countless deliberate acts, shaping morale, perception, and the squad's capacity to endure. By the end of these days, the weight of command had solidified into a tangible presence. Every gesture, order, and observation contributed to a delicate framework sustaining operational effectiveness and human spirit. Leadership was an ongoing synthesis of strategy, observation, and empathy, requiring continuous adaptation, vigilance, and understanding. In shared rations, whispered instructions, and quiet exchanges, the essence of command manifested, sustaining both mission and men alike. The morning light arrived pale and filtered, casting a muted glow across a battlefield that seemed to stretch endlessly, scarred with trenches, broken trees, and abandoned equipment. The squad moved deliberately, each step weighed with awareness, boots sinking into churned mud, eyes scanning every shadow, ears attuned to the faintest sound. Leadership felt omnipresent, each decision, glance, and word carried weight beyond the immediate moment. Maintaining vigilance, managing fatigue, and balancing the squad's morale demanded constant attention, a delicate interplay of instinct, experience, and empathy that left no room for lapse. Combat had evolved into a series of rapid, unpredictable encounters. Ambushes appeared suddenly, forcing split-second judgment and immediate adaptation. Observing my men, I noted their varied responses. Some with calm precision, others with brief hesitation that needed correction, and a few with instinctive brilliance that could turn a dangerous situation into survival. Every decision, when to advance, when to hold, how to maneuver, was fraught with consequence. Commands were shouted over the din of battle, gestures substituted when sound failed, and eyes scanned continuously for even the smallest clue of threat or opportunity. Leadership was immersive, immediate, and relentless, encompassing both strategy and the subtle management of human endurance. Amid chaos, small acts of humanity persisted. Soldiers shared water and rations, adjusted each other's gear, and exchanged brief words of encouragement. Occasionally, a fleeting smile or quiet chuckle slipped through. These micro-actions, seemingly minor, carried immense psychological weight. They reinforced trust, strengthened morale, and reminded the squad that human connection could not be neglected, even in the most perilous circumstances. I observed how these subtle interactions often dictated performance under pressure, bolstering cohesion and resilience when it was needed most. Rations remained limited, demanding creativity and careful management. Meals became rituals of sustenance. Dried vegetables combined with scraps of meat, beans simmered over embers, bread divided with meticulous care. Preparing and sharing these meals created moments of normalcy, opportunities to strengthen camaraderie and morale. Even minor indulgences, a tin of fruit, a scrap of chocolate, a sip of coffee, were treasured symbols of comfort, reminders of life beyond the battlefield. Laughter, though brief and rare, carried a disproportionate weight against the backdrop of tension and fatigue.